All right, welcome listeners. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Unsecurity Podcast. This is episode number 136. The date is June 16th, 2021. Joining me is my good friend, Ryan Cloutier. Hey, Ryan.
Hey, Evan.
How you doing?
Doing good, man. I'm excited for today's topic.
Yeah, well, it's right up your alley for sure. So for listeners, Brad's taken a few weeks off. We've all got tons of things to do, and he's no exception. So, and that's not like you and I don't have tons of things to do too, but everybody needs a break once in a while. And so Brad's taking his. And our topic today, I figured we'd talk about K-12 cybersecurity. You know a thing or two about that, don't you?
Just a little bit.
Yeah. So, and I've been working on state and local government, and, it's kind of it's hard to figure out where the lines are. Do you have that struggle with K-12?
I do. It's a very complex environment, and it can be different state to state, and it can be different culture to culture within the community. So urban districts tend to do things a certain way. Rural districts tend to do them slightly different. And what's really interesting is you try to navigate the who's who, right? So as we try to implement information and cybersecurity risk in these institutions, you got to get the right buy-in from the right folks. And one of the big challenges that I think we share between K-12 and state government is finding out who the right players in the game are. And it's not always the ones that you would think it would be. It's not automatically just the CIO or the CISO, right? It could be that the CISO needs the buy-in of the House chair, or other players in the legislative space on the state side. And in the school space, it can be different types of leadership, or in some cases, even buy-in from the union, from the teachers union.
Yeah, and it's weird because it seems like in states, there's no two states work the same way. And I think it's even worse in K-12 because, you've got, who governs K-12 in the United States?
So interestingly enough, that no one, there is no, you would think Department of Ed, that would be your automatic default, right? Well, Federal Department of Ed. Well, no, they set guidelines and standards for curriculum and for, what the students need to learn to be accredited. But they don't set guidelines for how you manage your district. And, in Minnesota here, we have independent school districts. So they could actually span county lines, city lines. But if we look at our friends down in Florida, they do it based on county. So each county has a school district. If we go to our friends, say in Texas, Texas is also an independent school district setup, but they tend to do it more based around city.
So is it, who decides whether it's independent or not? Is it the state that kind of sets that piece up?
Yeah, so what that comes down to is the way that the funding works within a given state. So an independent school district gets its funding based on property tax value from the cities or counties within their defined district boundaries. And all the schools in all the states do get a small portion of money from the federal government, and they get a small portion of money from the state governments. The rest of the money has to be made through either bond initiatives, property tax hikes, bake sales. A lot of schools use events as a way of generating revenue for the school to be able to pay for things like laptops and books. And I know books are a little dated. I don't think they actually use those anymore, but to pay.
Does anybody read anymore?
Well, I mean, based on the way I see people behaving, no, but
right.
But it's a hodgepodge, and ultimately it comes down to the local community that school district is serving ultimately has the most authority and say over how that school district gets funded, what they're going to spend that funding on. So a lot of times the school board is the one that ultimately carries the authority.
See, that's okay. And I'm going to take us on a little side track because I remember especially this last year, right? There's been a lot of this race thing, not race thing, it's racism and discussions about that. And one of the things somebody had said something about systemic racism, right? And I was like, I don't really know what that is, so give me an example of that. So that, because I think all of us want to be part, not all of us, but all of us should want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And so they brought up the issue of schools being funded by, like you said, local property taxes. So you take, our backyard here, Minneapolis, Minneapolis School District is funded by property taxes. And where I live in Waconia, I think the income per capita is higher, property values are higher. So students in Waconia seem to get better equipment, probably better instruction, more opportunities than people in, the inner city. Is that right?
It is absolutely right. We here in Minnesota, we have a couple of districts, and I won't name them, but they are what we call the Gold Coast. They have the money. That's where the majority of wealth in this state is concentrated into a handful of cities on the western edge of the metro. And they have the best funded programs. They have the best talent. They have the best equipment. And that's because they're able to offset that state dollar value. So the state gives every school a flat fee for a student. And then the difference has to be made up by the local community. So a community that is more impoverished is going to struggle to overcome that offset, where a community that's wealthy is able to do so more easily. The other thing that I found interesting, I was actually talking with one of those districts who I won't name, and I said, how come you guys seem to always have so much more money left over? And the answer I was given is, Ryan, one family can write a check for our entire athletics program, and now we don't have to spend that money. So by affluent parents being able to write very large checks to cover things like returfing of the football field, that money then that was allocated for that can then be reallocated to something else. And when you get into an urban setting or an inner city setting, those opportunities are so much more reduced. You don't have wealthy families that can come in and just, I'm going to buy new uniforms and a mascot, new lighting for the football field. Here's a couple $100,000. When they have to pay for those things, they have to pay that out of what we call the general fund. And the general fund is really used for everything. And so when you take away, $30,000 to pave a parking lot, well, that's a whole bunch of laptop upgrades. That's a whole bunch of, being able to pay to protect the internet or things like that.
Yeah. So that's probably for another discussion, because that certainly seems like it needs to be fixed, right? There's and when it comes to information security and what we do, I think those richer, let's call them richer school districts, have more leeway. They have more, they can make mistakes and recover more easily, meaning they can misspend. They can go buy that blinky light, even though it's not maybe the best thing for them to buy from a security perspective. They can afford to make those mistakes, whereas rural districts and districts in the inner city, urban districts, they can't afford that.
Exactly. And even fundraising, let's say they do make that mistake and now they got to recoup $1 million. Well, I know for a fact that one of our richer districts was able to make $1 million selling candy bars.
Wow.
You're never going to be able to do that in an inner city setting because the families don't have enough disposable income. So while they want to buy that candy bar, heck, they want to buy them all, they don't have that financial capability. And so their students ultimately end up suffering. And I think that's where the systemic, just to tie this off in a knot, that's where I think the systemic piece comes into play, is that you have a disadvantaged group of people who, in order to get the advantage, have to be able to take advantage of the advantage, and they can't. So the loop perpetuates itself. So I can't make $1 million in candy bar sales. Therefore, we can't offset that mistake that we made. Or in the cases too, a lot of times, school districts have to pay lawsuits. School districts have to cover, staff that are inappropriate in some cases, or other types of things where they get sued. And then that money comes out of that general fund and they're left with even less. And the bigger the school districts are, generally speaking, too, the largest school districts in the state of Minnesota are also the most impoverished.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I know that you and I have talked a lot because we strategize a lot on different things. And you were telling me about some of the mega districts, and now mega districts, they sort of run themselves like a business.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one side of the spectrum. And then the other side of the spectrum is like maybe a rural district where the person who's the technology director is also the gym teacher and is also the baseball coach.
Yeah.
That's hard.
And it's very common. I've worked with districts of all sizes and all demographics across the country. I've worked with inner city urban districts. I've worked with rural districts in predominantly Caucasian communities. I've worked with southern districts and northern districts, and they all approach things a little different. But the common theme is the rural districts tend to wear more hats. They tend to have to be the security person, the network person, the desktop support person, plus they've got to pop out to teach history, and they got to go help out on the football field because they're the coach. You don't really see that problem in the metropolitan districts, and especially in the mega districts. Mega districts really do run like enterprises. They're funded like enterprises. One that comes to mind that's one of the largest in the nation, they have a IT staff of 1,500 people. That's more IT staff than most big businesses of a similar size and budget.
Right. Well, and it seems like, so every one of these, when we talk about protecting data, protecting information, I think one of the big, really important, types of data to protect are the students, right? And their families, right? Protect their personally identifiable information. But then there's also the whole skill level thing, right? The skill set. We need more security people. We've said before, information security is a life skill. It's probably more likely in some of these more affluent school districts that they're getting those things than, the rest of the students. I mean, we have to fix this. I think there's many issues, because let's say that I am an inner city, and it's not just black and white. It just happens to be that most of the, I think, Blacks in our country are concentrated in cities, right? But there's also white students there. And if I'm already starting off disadvantaged, right, I've got kind of the deck stacked against me, meaning I don't have the same opportunities you do. I don't have the same equipment you do. I don't have the same quality of instruction you do. Lots of things. Couple that with the fact that it's probably more likely that my data would be exposed because it's not being properly protected, because you just don't have the resources to do it, maybe. And now, stack that on top, right? Now it's more likely that my identity will be stolen. I'll have to deal with that. You know what I mean? It's kind of beating them down a little bit, isn't it?
Well, it is. And the other thing that, I think a lot of folks outside of K-12 don't realize is that a K-12 school district has all the data, medical data, financial data, behavioral data. They have data on your child and on the children and staff that they're responsible for that bumps up against HIPAA, but they're not a medical facility. They're not an insurance collector, provider, or doctor's office, so they're not regulated by HIPAA. The laws that regulate school districts traditionally are laws that were wrote in the 1970s, specifically so that families could know what records the schools were keeping about their student, not so much so that data needed to be protected. And then what you now have is a hodgepodge across the country of different attempts to create student privacy laws. The best one I've seen yet to date is out of Illinois. It's called SOPA. And what it says is that all school districts in Illinois must maintain reasonable security. What they failed to define was what is reasonable security. So now you have a law that says you have to do a thing, but there's no definition for what that thing is. And we've seen this over and over, 20 plus years in this industry. The word reasonable gets thrown around, but nobody wants to define what it means. And so now everybody scrambles to try to meet that. And you still wind up with 150 different ways that people attempted to hit it. And maybe out of that group, 10 actually achieved what a security professional would then call reasonable.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I know that we're trying to do, with Security Studio and S2 School and the things you preach, and is trying to level that playing field a little bit, right? So we can because we know that most of the protection, most of the breaches happen because of lack of fundamentals, right? It's not because I don't have AI. It's not because I don't have, some super sophisticated machine learning device. It's the basics, it's the fundamentals, right? Somebody left RDP open, or somebody clicked a phishing link, or, it's stuff like that. So I think without transferring a whole bunch of money, I mean, that one thing does need to be fixed, right? But we don't do that. We're security people. I don't determine how schools get run. I don't determine, funding stuff. But what I can do is do my best, and is do our best to make sure that school districts aren't pissing away money, that every dollar you're spending on information security is being spent wisely. And it's being spent towards those fundamentals, those things that are really, really important that you do.
Yeah, and I just published a article. You can find it on Security Studio's blog. It's the top 5 things that schools need to do to prepare for ransomware. I've started preaching not prevention, but recovery. Prevention has seemed not to work. We've tried prevention, it didn't work. So now I'm pivoting to say, prevention, we still need to do it. It's still important. But what's more important right now, what's more helpful to where you invest that next dollar, is making sure you're recoverable, making sure that you're ready for the event when it happens and you're able to get back on your feet. There's, and part of this is 2 things that are going on in schools today that don't go on at the same volume outside of school. And the first is insider threat. So insider threat exists within a company, private business. And when you discover that person, you fire them, you call the police, and you prosecute them. But in a K-12 setting, that's not what happens, because really you're talking about a curious child, a child who is now demonstrating some skills and talents and curiosities that should be shepherded towards the right things, towards, hey, while I'm not happy that you hacked us, I'm not happy that you took down the firewall. That's actually a job skill. Let us redirect you. And schools are the only place where the inside attacker is invited back 3 days later and handed back their computing equipment. And so you have that factor in play. And that's it. That's actually a bigger factor that really makes the news for a handful of different reasons, a lot of which is because it involves a juvenile and potential crime. And so that's why it's not hitting the news. And the other challenge there is that in a lot of cases, those students are actually helping the IT staff to secure the network. And so we're using children to secure the network of the school. And you don't see that in the business side. So I think, that's where a lot of schools struggle when it comes to where to spend that next dollar, because let's be honest, they're getting their cybersecurity advice from a 14-year-old.
Yeah, good point. Good point. When I love, and you brought up a couple of other good points. So, and I do want to talk about, your article. I think it's awesome. I love the fact that you kept it to 5. It's simple, it's straightforward. And that's one of the things that is our mantra, right? Simplicity is your best friend. Complexity is your worst enemy. So keeping things simple. So the more stuff you add into the environment, the more, networks, the more devices, the more technologies, the harder it gets to secure those things. So if you are in a rural community or, an inner city where you do struggle with funding, the wrong place to spend it is probably on technology. You probably need to spend more time figuring out where you're at, right? And making sure you are recoverable. This has never been about risk elimination. It's always been about risk management. And if you understand what risk management means, it means you can't eliminate the likelihood and or impact of something bad happening. It will happen. It happens to everybody. It's just a matter of time.
Well, in schools, it's interesting because schools know this for everything outside of information security. So they have very robust plans for dealing with severe weather, fire, active shooter, gas leak, whatever, name a scenario that could potentially jeopardize, life or limb. And they've got a plan for it. They've got a plan that they've documented, that they've tested, that's got 18 copies around the building. Everybody knows where it is and they know what to do. Where we have fallen down is by treating information security as somehow separate of those other activities, as somehow not related to or associated to those activities. And so when I'm consulting and coaching these schools, I tell them, don't do this separate, make it part of, involve the same humans, by the way, who helped you figure out your severe weather plan. Let's talk to them too. They've got a role to play here. This isn't all just about computers. Now, you brought up a point earlier I just want to circle back on, which is complexity. So I just got the latest stats for wireless access point planning for K-12. So as they just figure out, how much coverage do I need and how many devices, the new number per student is 9 devices per student.
So what?
9 devices per student. So when they're planning their wireless access volume, when they're trying to decide how many access points they need and what kind of coverage volume they're going to need to support from a device perspective, the current guidance is advising them to account for 9 devices per human being in the building.
How can I have 9 devices?
Wearables,
I suppose.
so we ignore the wearables, right? So you've got wearables, you've got smartphone, you've got district issued equipment, so they could have a laptop. They could also have there's some ed tech technology. They might have a laptop and also have kind of a smart device. Part of that is when they're doing the per student, they're also factoring what happens when mom and dad comes to school. So now I've got an auditorium. I've got mom, dad, brother, sister, nephew, grandma.
Yeah.
They've all got 2 to 4 devices on them each, all connected up to the Wi-Fi. So it's fascinating because the K-12 building has more technology inside of it than some of the most sophisticated businesses in the world. It's amazing when I start doing these device counts, even in a rural community. Let's say they have what we call 1-to-1 initiative. So what this means is there's 1 piece of technology per student. In a lot of cases, it's a Chromebook or an iPad or something like that. But each student has their own dedicated device. So if I've got 1,200 students, that's 1,200 devices. That's not including the management network. That's not including the backbone infrastructure. That's not including any of my switches and cores and routers or any of that stuff. It's not including my staff. It's not including my transportation service technology, my food service technology, my athletics technologies that maybe my athletics field is using or my athletics department, And so when you start looking at that, you're like, wait, 1 human being, 1 singular human being is responsible for 5,000 devices. And when you have that many devices, and the listeners who have worked support know this, you don't have any time left to do the right thing because you're constantly in a break fix cycle. You're constantly replacing a laptop, fixing a screen, rebooting something, jiggering the RJ45 port that's too worn out, but you don't have time to replace it. So you slap some Scotch tape on it and hope that it holds.
Right.
And that's the reality. That's what our poor rural schools are dealing with today, is thousands of devices, even at the smallest size. And no time or ability to, even if they know the right things to do, they can't do it because they're too busy doing the day-to-day support work of making sure that Johnny's iPad that he just drop kicked for the 14th time today is going to work.
Right. Well, so that does go back to the, better funding for schools. And it doesn't mean more funding. I said better funding, right? I mean, if you've got some schools and, and I'm not a socialist, but anything that you have that the government provides for you, you're already a socialist. That's a socialist enterprise, right? If the government is providing something for me, that is what socialism essentially is. And schools are already there anyway. So sort of, but we have to figure out a better way to distribute income.
Well, what's interesting is there is a lot of funding now available. So there was some CARES money, and they could spend the CARES money on cyber, but the IT team never knew that. And so it got ate up by the other departments. Then there's another grant from Homeland that came along, but if you don't know it exists, you don't know to apply for it, and they're not promoting it well. Then we have the whole E-rate. So one gripe that I've had over the years in working with K-12 is that the majority of K-12 schools in the United States today get their internet and the associated hardware to, take that fiber and turn it into, an available internet source for the students. That comes through a grant program from the FCC that's called E-rate. E-rate, up until recent, wasn't even considering protecting the network that they paid to have installed. So they provided the danger, they paid for the danger to be present, but they did not allow you to spend that E-rate money on things like antivirus, anti-malware, or IPS-IDS, or any of the, effective blinky lights. There are some blinky lights that do help you. Most of them don't, but a couple of them do. But they couldn't use the money for that. They couldn't use it for managed service. Now, there's been a petition through an organization that I work closely with called COSIN, or the Consortium of School Networking, to sway FCC to say E-rate needs to be made available to spend on cyber. And we're making some progress in that regard. Well, while that's happening, a new funding initiative has come up because there are still schools today that don't have broadband access. There are schools today, so we talk about this equity and inclusivity, right? One of the big challenges between urban and rural, not just from a demographic challenge, but from an actual availability, is my outer rural communities don't even have broadband available to them. The best they can hope for is a couple of paired T1s, or maybe some rip roaring 25 megabit a second DSL connection. Well, how do those students in those communities compete with somebody in my neighborhood who's got a gig fiber connection right to the home?
Right.
They can't. And so they've created this new funding stream to be able to bring broadband to the homes and to the schools. One of the things I just read about is they're actually taking the school buses that have like 5G hotspots on them, and they're parking them in like the shopping mall parking lot so the students can go work off the school bus. Now think about the safety element here. You're leaving in an empty school bus in a shopping center parking lot and just saying, hey kids, here's where you can go get internet because you don't have it at home.
Right.
No one's monitoring that. No one's supervising that. There's no staff member present to ensure the student safety, or, crazy idea, the safety of the wireless hotspot itself.
Right. Well, and so all those things are good, but they were all more funding. You know what I mean?
More funding, but none of the funding actually focusing on fixing the core fundamentals.
Well, right. And sort of leveling the playing field, right? I mean, it's just the problem continues to get worse and worse when, this goes up and this stays the same, right? I mean, simple, geometry would tell you that. So that's a challenge, because even if I told you all, like you said, even if I told you all the things, or you knew all the things to do to secure your environment, you don't have the staff, the time. You probably, most of the stuff you don't need equipment, right? I wish more people would learn to use the equipment they have better, as opposed to going out and getting more equipment. So to me, that's not the big problem. The problem is you need to use it right. And so, and it goes hand in hand with what you've said before about information security being a life skill. It's not all this, the basics, the fundamentals. You don't need an expert. You don't need me or you to go do this stuff for you.
Right.
You can do it yourself. Assuming you have the time and the staff.
Well, and therein lies the thing. I just actually was talking with one of the districts that I mentor today, and it took us 2 years, and this is with dedicated people, dedicated focus and dedicated dollars, leadership support, all the things that you need to make a successful security program. And it still took us 2 years to get to the point we were today, where I said, we're now ready for our first tabletop. We've done enough block and tackling. We know what we've got for the most part. We will never be perfect, but we're at about 97% accuracy. We've got plans for responding. We've got the right phone numbers of the right people, and we've printed it off and took it off site, right? We've done these basic block and tackles, but it took us 2 years. And the biggest reason for that was they were so far away from the start line at the beginning of our journey. And there were tools that had been purchased that they weren't using effectively or correctly. Tools that, they were sold at a conference that this is the answer to your problem. And the vendor maybe forgot to mention you need 2 FTEs to configure this thing and 5 FTEs to run this thing.
Yeah, forgot to mention,
right? And now we're there. And what's nice though is, and keep your eye on Security Studio, because we're going to continue to publish some stuff out in the next coming weeks. We're going to be doing a case study on this district, and we're going to give you the recipe. We're going to tell you what we did and how we did it, and why we did it, and why we picked the order of things that we did, and how we built support within the leadership, within the non-technical community, how we got the community at large to be on board with things. Because I think that is where everybody could be doing something today that doesn't require a knowledge of how InfoSec works. It doesn't require a bunch of money, or any money in a lot of cases, but just some basic stuff. How do you start to build support for security culture? Because without that, you're really going to struggle to implement. That was the other thing is, getting something simple like multi-factor implemented was a part art, part science. And it was a very much a political dance of making sure we had the right buy-in from the right folks before we even mentioned it. Yeah. We had to build support in the back channel. And then we went to the staff with all the support behind us to say, we're doing this for your benefit. And right. It was, basically telling the staff, hey, if you want to get paid on Friday, we have to do this. If you don't do this, we can't guarantee you get paid. And all of a sudden, all that resistance went away. Yeah. But it was a creative process. And I think that's what a lot of schools today, and those of you that are listening, if you've got kids in your school and even a little bit about information security, go down and see if you can lend an hour. You can probably do more to help your school in 1 hour of donated time than they will be able to get accomplished on their own in 3 years.
Yeah, well, and you bring up, again, a lot of good wisdom, man. I think we have this instant gratification sort of society nowadays where we're moving so fast. When you do an assessment of an organization or a school, there's this, desire to go from, let's say, a 400 to a 700, and we got to do it by next school year, right? But you can't. That's not how security works, right? It takes time. You have to lay the structure. It's not that those blinky lights that you buy aren't effective. A lot of times you're not ready for it.
Right.
That's not your blinky light today. You need to do things like asset management. And actually, that's a great segue. Let's go into your article. So like you said, it's on the Security Studio. If you go to the website and under resources, go to blog, you'll see that the article that you wrote, top 5 things to prepare for ransomware in K-12. The number one thing you have listed here is know what you have in your environment.
Yep. Basic inventory, right? What do I have? If I don't know what I have, I can't protect it. And if I don't know what I have, I don't know how critical it is, because I'm not necessarily going to apply the same level of protection to everything. Not only does that not make sense from a practicality standpoint, but if I'm pinching pennies, I might ignore a lower risk thing. I might make that decision. I might decide that the best risk decision for my district is not to worry about the thing that has no PII on it, and instead double down on the thing that has all the PII. Right. But if I don't know, I don't know. And actually, a quick story of what prompted that. I was working with a district a few years ago, and we did an NMAP. We did a network analysis, scan the network, see what we had. And we found a network segment that no one could tell me what it was. I said, what is this? Well, we don't know. Well, I see a lot of traffic going to it. What's going on? So we start digging into it, and nobody that had built the network was still there. Well, then we started doing some trap and trace and what's actually going across this. Well, lo and behold, we find it's the public library. So then we go to the public library and we find out that they have a VLAN to the fire station. And so here we now have emergency services traffic routing through a public library, routing through a school district. And no one knew. The fire department didn't know. They figured we get the internet from the city. And the city says, yeah, you get your internet from us. They forgot to mention that we built a bridge off of the library to give you that internet because you guys were physically close in proximity. And the library didn't know that they were getting theirs because they said, well, we get ours from the city. Well, it turns out that the school had gotten the grant money to get the big 10 gig trunk dropped in. And somebody in their infinite wisdom said, yeah, I can pair off a few gig for you. Forgot to write it down, forgot to tell anybody. So I've run into that a few times. That's the most extreme example I've seen, but I've run into it a few times. And so knowing what the heck you got, especially if you have a high churn environment, and a lot of times K-12 tech will have low churn at the senior level. Those folks that got in early, put in an Apple IIe and are now the CTO. But you tend to have a higher churn at the younger 1 to 3 years experience, because once they get that 3-year experience, they're off to chasing paychecks.
Right.
And so you lose that knowledge. So yeah, they may have knew what was going on, but then they left to go get that next job.
Yeah, and you can't blame them for that. I mean, and
No, not at all.
And the thing is too about your top 5. Security is security. These same top 5 apply to the private sector. You know what I mean? It's like, and it's just logic. I was talking to a friend of mine today, and I don't mean, some people will get offended, but they always get offended, I guess. I'm like, did people get dumber after COVID? It seems like it, because when you talk about just these straightforward, logical things, and I mean, because I said the same thing to the state of one of the states. I was giving a talk to their Blue Ribbon Commission, and they're talking about zero trust, and they're talking about this and that. It's like, can anybody here tell me what the current state of security is here in the state?
Right.
No. Well, then how the hell would I know where I'm supposed to go and what I'm supposed to do and all this other good stuff if I don't even know myself? And so I did another one of the organizations that you and I are doing a trial with, for an integration into Security Studio. He did just an OSINT on, using his tool on this state. And oh my God, man, 1,007.
I saw the findings. Yeah, I saw the findings.
Oh my gosh. Right. And I'm not even going to go and talk to this state CISO about that right now, because
no,
you couldn't do anything with it.
No.
It would be just alarmist. And I think that's what sometimes they do, right?
Right. Well, and what I saw in that, by the way, was an overarching theme. I saw a theme. Yeah. It's actually not even a security theme. It's what I observed in the data is a lack of a process. And I won't go into any more details. I don't want to give away, what it is I saw. But what I saw was the end result of a lack of a process. And had a particular process been in play, 98% of what I saw would not have been there.
Well, and this same thing applies at states, at K-12 and at home.
Yes.
How often do, people just go and buy something, plug it into the network, and oh, look, now I got this thing that does this thing. Oh, that's really cool. And then your friend comes over and says, oh, I want a thing that does that thing too. And so they go buy the thing that does that thing. Meanwhile, they forgot about the other 11 things, that are 12 or 20 things they already have on the network that are doing a bunch of things. And that's what I was saying, back to the complexity being your worst enemy. At some point, you have to stop the insanity and just take inventory. What do I have? What am I responsible for? What networks, what equipment, what software, what data? The problem just continues to get worse and worse and worse. At some point, you have to do it.
And then if you want to take it to an advanced level, the next question is, what does it do for me?
Exactly. Yeah, I
So
love
I
that.
have it, but then what does it do for me? What is it doing?
I love that question. My favorite question to ask is why.
Yes.
We want to go buy this thing. Why?
Why?
Because you know, da 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 da. Why? You know, and you get that too from, you know, you and I do a lot of mentoring, and you know, everybody wants to be a CISO. Not everybody, but you know,
A lot of people do, but yeah, why?
Yeah, I love asking that. So why? And then they just like, huh? Yeah, I guess I don't know why. You might want to think about that.
What I find most surprising with that question when I challenge back the why, more often than not, the first answer I get is because I want to be able to control the direction of the technology. And then I have to break their little hearts and say, you do realize that's not the job. That you don't get to play with the tech. That's you're so far removed from it. You are a politician, you are a cheerleader, you're all these things, but you're none of those technological things that you love, that you think you're going to have all this sway and influence, and it's just not how it works. And when they hear that, they're like, oh, wait, I'm just standing around waiting to get fired. Yeah, that's kind of your job. They're like,
yeah, if you don't play it right.
Yeah, I don't want that. I wanted to do the tech. And
so for any new person who's listening, when somebody asks you why you want to be a CISO, you can say, because I love serving people and I want to do everything I can to protect them. Something like that.
That's a great answer.
You know what I mean? Because that's why I do it. And I think that's why you do it too.
100%.
Yeah. All right. So number one in your list is know what you have in your environment. I agree 100%, man. Asset inventory. It doesn't sound sexy. It's not sexy, but you have to do it. And if you're doing this, you're going through your asset inventory. Keep in mind as you're conducting that inventory that you're going to need to build process to make sure that it continues, that you don't find yourself in the same crappy position that you're in right now. So things like acquisition, how do we add new things into our inventory? How do we get rid of things in our inventory? It's not just what do I have right now? How am I going to maintain this thing I have right now? Right? That's very important. So I love number one, man. Number two, know your risk level. Risk, it's like the board game kind of risk, or what?
Exactly. No, you got to know your level of exposure. And just because there is a risk doesn't mean that it's a problem. We talk you and I have talked about this many times, right? It's impact, likelihood. I have as a human, with my genes, I have like a 70% chance, a risk of getting cancer at some point in my life. It seems to run in the blood. It's a family thing, right? Now the likelihood is pretty high, but because I'm proactive, because I have good healthcare, because I go and get my scans and do these things, the impact is greatly reduced. So I don't need to run around in fear that I'm going to get the cancer tomorrow and die from it, because I've got a strategy for identifying, for responding, right? For containing, for cleaning it up, right? Exactly. Ultimately eradicating it, and then monitoring, right? And actually cancer is a great example because it lays directly on top of incident response process. They're a one-to-one relationship. You first must identify, right? So I think, all too often the vendors, and I don't want to just pick on vendors, but all too often our industry as a whole has overblown certain risks while completely ignoring things that to me are just flat out alarming. Just like, whoa, you're worried about that, but that's okay? No way, no how.
Right. Well, and the thing is, and I try to tell people this too, you do risk assessments all the time. We all do.
Continuous. It's part of being a human.
Right. When I put on that seatbelt, when I start up that car, when I decide I'm going to eat this thing, or I decide I'm going to smoke that thing or drink that thing, you're doing risk assessments all the time. When you drive down the road and you come up to, you see the light turn yellow, you do this really quick risk assessment. You look around, right? What's the likelihood of me getting T-boned here, or a police officer? You do these things, but those things come natural to you because it's usually in your physical realm, right? That you can touch that stuff. You can see that stuff. You also grew up with that stuff. You and I, me more so, I'm not part of that generation where I grew up with technology.
Right.
I didn't have a cell phone. So I gapped this thing. So I had to learn it as I went. So that's why one of the reasons I know that this is a learnable thing.
Mhm.
This isn't like, oh, you were just born into it. No, you learned it. We all learned it. And so the challenge then is taking this new world, this electronic digital world, how do I make that natural to me? It is natural to me because I've been doing it for so long, and it's natural to you. So how do we take this thing and impart it to others? Well, at first, I'll tell you for sure, it's mundane, it's confusing, it's uncomfortable, it doesn't feel good when you do your first risk assessment. I think that's why a lot of people don't do it. But believe me, on the other side of it is safety. You know what I mean?
Well, and part of that too is how we look at risk assessments. A lot of times, especially if you've never had one, I run into this all the time in schools. I've actually had people hide the findings from their leadership because they were afraid that it would be interpreted as them failing to do their job. And what I try to tell people is just like when you go to the doctor, okay, and you go to the doctor to get your physical, or in my case, I got to get colonoscopies every couple of years. It's totally not a pleasant experience, by the way. The procedure, who cares? I don't remember the procedure, but the day before it, it's awful, right? But I do this as a preventative, as an inspection. And when they have found things, and they have found, polyps and other such things over time, then they deal with them, right? Because that's part of the management. I don't get that report and go, oh God, I've lived such a horrible lifestyle that I'm now, dealing with this. I get the report now. The doctor did say maybe I should cut back on sugar a little bit, and maybe I need to be thinking about the fact that I'm 40, not 20. So some of my invincibility has worn off, and I need to maybe eat a few more vegetables and do, these things. But that's because that's what I need to do to continue to ride this ride. When we do these risk assessments, that first finding is always going to be awful because you've never done it before. Nobody gets their first one and it looks great. It's just not reality. But instead of looking at it as a negative, as a failure on you and the efforts that you've put in your career or your time with this company, look at it as you've just never been at this maturity level before. You've just never been 40 before. And now you do have to start worrying about eating those vegetables, and you do have to start worrying about doing exercise and not just sitting in a chair in front of a keyboard all day. And so I try to shape the message that way, to say this isn't a naughty report. This is our roadmap for improvement, because we've never been here before. So let's not use it to look at things retrospectively, because I think that's dangerous. I think if you do that, you create more fear and more hesitance. I think if we use it as however we got to where we are was good and we're here, but now we need to do things different to go forward. And I think
I agree.
Sell that.
Absolutely, man. And it's like, I can't hold somebody accountable for something that they didn't know that they were accountable for.
Right.
You know what I mean? You do an assessment. So I can hold you accountable for doing an assessment. I can hold you accountable to those things. But that first assessment, the first few assessments, how could I possibly, come down hard on you when you didn't even know that these things were there?
But our industry sucks at that, because we have come down on them like a stack of bricks. Oh, you better fix all this tomorrow or the apocalypse is upon you. That's not helping anybody to say, I want to invite you in to help me do this. I want it, right? So we get that resistance. And that's why we see a lot of times that only compliance-driven organizations openly invite people in to do risk assessments. And if you go to the smaller businesses, or you go to the non-regulated industries, they're like, oh, we don't need all that. We're doing just fine. Everything's fine.
Right. Well, that's another reason why, if you're going to do, eventually you're going to do a risk assessment, because there's no other way to do security. It's part of the equation. But when you do it yourself, right? There's so much good education in there. And we talked, I've mentioned it numerous times about this being a life skill. It's a new world, right? This is how we operate. It's not just about risk and making things better. It's also about learning. There's such a good learning experience in it.
Well, it's about making sure I got bacon. Because let's be honest, if you don't start fixing things here, there's going to be less bacon available. So if for no other reason, do it for that.
You do not want to see me without bacon. That's not good. Number three, okay, so number one, just to recap real quick, and then we'll get through this last three pretty quick. Number one was know what you have in your environment. For sure. You can't protect things you don't know you have. That's just how it works. Number two, know your risk level. Do a risk assessment. Obviously, Security Studio, that's what we do. But if you want to do it on a sheet of paper with, with a group of staff members over lunch, fine. That's a start, right? You have to start. You have to do it. And God, I beg people, please. Number three is air gap your system and data backups. Now, why would I ask people to do that, Ryan?
So the only way to guarantee that a backup is safe from cyber criminals is to have it completely physically offline.
Yep.
Truly air gap, not just in a box that's connected to a wake on LAN and turned off, actually removing the data media physically out of the technology and placing it in a cardboard box and a locked filing cabinet, taking it to your neighbor's house, whatever that looks like. But it's the only way to guarantee that that backup is safe from cyber criminals. If you put it in the cloud, then you can get to it, they can get to it. If you have it on a NAS, I don't care how many VLANs and multi-factors are in between, if you can get to it, they can get to it. The only way they can't get to it is if it has been physically removed and stored separate. And when I say that, I also encourage you to store that securely, because if you don't encrypt that backup, then maybe you have an employee who decides to go rogue and can get to it. But doing that will reduce the amount of time that you're down with ransomware, and it will speed up your ability to recover and get back to an operational status.
100%. Yeah. And ransomware, schools are getting tagged all over the place all the time. So you need to protect, because they know that they're going to get paid, right? And now insurance is more and more likely to not cover you if you're not doing these things. And what I've been telling people is, go check that back storage, that IT storage room that everybody has, and see if you've got the tape library in there still.
Yep.
If you do, dust it off.
Reactivate it.
Yes, because I don't know why we decided. I do know why. It's because of convenience and
cloud.
Right. And we're so addicted to convenience. It's nuts, so, but tape backup it worked from a security perspective. There was no need to ever change it, other than, deterioration of the media over time, blah, blah, blah. But that was, you could account for that.
Right. Well, and it's back in fashion. So if you don't have some, you can go buy some brand new ones. They're pretty sweet.
I have fond memories, man, of Iron Mountain coming, every so often, the same time, every time. You'd visit with them. Hey, how it's going, whatever. And yeah, I remember those, or taking tapes home with me. Although that's, not the best place to store it. It certainly protects it from ransomware.
Right.
Excuse me. Number four is implement multi-factor authentication. So and for listeners who don't know what multi-factor authentication is, just real quick, there are 3 factors to authentication. It's something you know, something you have, and something you are, right? Those are the 3 factors. Something you know, an example would be a PIN number, a password, something in the head. Something you have would be something physical, whether it be a phone that you get a text message on, whether it be a dongle that you put into the USB port, whatever. It's something you physically have, and then the something you are would be, biometric, maybe a fingerprint scan. When we say multi-factor, we're usually referring to something that you have and something that you know, right? That's the most common implementation of multi-factor. The reason why this is really, really important is because phishing is still the number one way to get into your environment. All I have to do is talk you out of your password, right? It's really hard to talk you out of your phone. I can do that, but it's a lot more work, and it's probably not going to happen.
Exactly. And, it's a good stopgap measure. And the reason I put that on the list is because multi-factor, if you have implemented it, can be the first indicator that something funny is going on. And so not only does it act as a why can I not do this? We just taught the damn
Prevent,
class.
preventative.
It's a preventative control, but it's also a detective control.
Yep. Yeah, good point. Which then leads into your number 5. So where to use multi-factor authentication? In my opinion, there's absolutely zero excuse anywhere at any time to have any externally exposed resource not secured with multi-factor authentication.
Right.
So it'd be remote access, that'd be your email, if you have remote access to your email, all your logins, for what are those school, some of those technologies?
Student information systems.
There you go. All should be multi-factor.
Yep.
And it's and like you said, you have a ton of experience. You're going to write this case study. I'm super excited to see that because you went through the process of getting a school district that didn't do it to doing it and embracing it. So huge success. It can be done.
Yeah, and we actually just announced today, we're going to be mandating VPN with multi-factor for all access to district resources going forward, hard stop.
Boom.
No
That's
more
how you do it.
publicly exposed district resources that are not public resources. So there are some that have to be public, for mom and dad or the community at large. But when it comes to anything that has sensitive data, no longer will those be allowed to be publicly exposed in any way, shape, or form to the internet. You will have to VPN in. You will have to MFA every single time. You won't be able to do the remember me. So I'm very, very excited about that because let me tell you, that was a hard sell.
And those are huge wins, man. And a lot of times the work that we do, we never get thanked for because the people that we're protecting never know that we're protecting them.
Right.
Doing the best job we possibly can. So that all that hard work will pay off. And I know that there are some listeners, and some, elite hackers who are like, well, but I could still hack it. That's not the point.
No.
When people say that stuff, it makes me laugh because you don't understand what the goal is. The goal is risk management, not stopping all you little hackers. So I always think that's funny. But you mentioned multi-factor authentication can be used as a detective control, which then, it's what I can't prevent, I better be able to detect. And once I detect it, I better have your number 5, a response plan. No excuse for not having a response plan.
Well, and you don't have to start out with some crazy overblown plan. The other thing that I did with this district that'll be in this case study is we walked our way into it. As a matter of fact, there are still about 3 sections in our IRP that need to be filled in, right? We're not done, but we're ready. We're functional. We'll be able to manage an incident. We'll be able to get the right folks engaged in a timely fashion and get our hands around it way better than we would have, say, 2 years ago. There's always room to improve, and it's continuous improvement. Where I have seen folks fail time and time again is trying to achieve perfection out of the gate, trying to create this incident response plan that is 977 pages long and completely ineffective because of it. A 3-pager is a great starting position. A 3-pager can do more to get response happening and start activating the other legs of the stool, if you will, than going with this. We did the same thing with our DR plan. We started out with critical assets first. We started out with about 35 assets. Let's just make sure we know how to turn them back on. And then because we got that part good, got the process good with a small subset, we were able to then scale that quite easily.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I mean, you can start with your incident response plan on a napkin.
Yep.
And start with a phone number. Who would you call?
Yep.
And that's a plan. That's the start. Then start expanding out from that, right? Start talking about, well, what inputs might I have into this plan? Meaning, what are the detective mechanisms? Is it a person who called the help desk? Is it, because you have to work through the workflow, right? But yeah, trying to get that. I mean, there's no such thing as a perfect plan. There's no such thing as a perfect policy. There's no such thing as a perfect risk assessment. Perfection would imply risk elimination. Again, that's not the goal. So having a plan that is functional and having a plan that lives, that continues to mature, where you eventually want to get with a good incident response plan is to make it an operational plan, meaning you're always using your incident response plan because you're always having incidents.
Right.
Because an incident doesn't mean it's like a breach. There's low severity incidents, medium severity incidents, and high severity incidents. It's usually only the high ones where you bring the incident response team in, but you're having incidents all the time. People are losing their passwords. Those things need to be noted, but that's the other end of the maturity spectrum, right?
Right.
Start here, but having that in mind is helpful as you march down the path, right?
Exactly. And it's defendable, right? Because if you don't, I can assure you by middle of 2022, if you do not have some type of cobbled together incident response plan, if you don't have multi-factor authentication in place, if you are not air gapping your backups and you can't say what's on your network, you probably are not insurable. You may very well start, if some of this legislation passes that I've seen, you will be found to be grossly and willfully negligent, especially, and for those of you listening, if you work in critical infrastructure or you work in anything that looks like it might turn into critical infrastructure, you guys are going to get it first, and they're not going to be nice about it. I've seen some of the initial stuff that they're talking about doing, and it is very much a boot on the neck approach.
Which it should be, because one of the things we've been missing for so long is accountability.
Yep.
Who's responsible for what? And then just saying it and not actually holding them accountable is like, threatening to punish a child and never actually punishing them. There's no consequences to their bad behavior, so they're never going to stop it. So I love the fact that they're doing a lot of those things. But I also think when I think of education, and I had this discussion today with the state of New Jersey, their folks, we don't do this for the money.
No.
Right? I mean, when you work in education, when you work in state and local government, you can get paid more in other places. You do this because there's something special about you, something special about the people you're serving. So even beyond like the negligence, when you don't do these things, at least these top 5, start here, you're actually hurting the people you're trying to serve versus serving them. So you're kind of going against your whole purpose. So look at it that way, maybe. That's not hard. Yeah. We'll help you. I mean, crap, man. My wife yells at me all the time because I fail to say, you got to learn to say no. I'm like, I can't. I'm addicted to yes. That's probably.
I'm catching grief. You spent the weekend with me. I caught grief for working on a work day.
I know, man. Well, my wife doesn't listen to the podcast, so that's good. And don't you tell her about this either, but I was so engrossed in my work on Monday evening, I didn't go to bed.
Whoops.
Yeah. So I was up from 6:30 in the morning, and it wasn't because I was, it wasn't like an incident. I was just getting into my jam, man. It was a good night. And before I knew it, it was 3:00 in the morning, and I have my meeting with Atnas at 4:30 Tuesday. I'm like, well, I could just cancel, or, well, I'm here. Well, I guess I'll just take the meeting. Yeah, one thing led to another.
Yeah, careful with that, pal.
Yeah,
that'll catch up to you.
Oh, it does. It does. My body tells me, like this morning when I got up at 7 a.m., my first thing I thought was, what did I do yesterday afternoon? And did I make any sense? So I replayed my meetings. I'm like, I think I'm good. I don't think I said anything stupid. Because one of the things people don't realize, maybe some people do, is you make a lot worse decisions when you're super tired. You just don't make any decisions. All right. Well, awesome, man. I love this episode. I'm excited about next week. You and I got a chemistry, just like me and Brad got a chemistry. It's just cool. So thanks for that. Any shout outs for you this week, real quick?
If you're in the Miami area, come find me next week. I'll be down at the MSP Expo and the IT Expo at the Miami Beach Convention Center. Come find us. Security Studio will be there. We're in booth number 6 something. We'll get it into the show notes. I got to look up the booth number, but come find us. Stop by, say hi. I'd love to chat with you. We'll have some of Evan's books that we'll be giving away. So for no other reason, come get your free copy of Unsecurity.
Yeah, and if you don't know how to read, it's good kindling.
Well, I mean, you could, I guess, but so yeah. So come find us. We're going to be there having a good time.
Nice.
Love to chat with you, get to meet some of you guys.
So you'll be in Miami, and next week I'll be in Orlando on a panel with some really good guys. ConnectWise, they're IT Nation or whatever.
Oh yeah, yep. I know those guys. Yeah.
Yeah, whatever thing they got going on down there. So somehow I got into that, and I didn't say yes. I think somebody just volunteered me, and next thing I know, I was there. So
That happens.
yeah, that is what it is. So thank you to all our listeners. Again, thank you, Ryan, for being here. Great conversation as always, man. I love talking to you. If you have something you'd like to tell us, or feel free to email the show at unsecurity@protonmail.com. If you're the social type, you can socialize with us on Twitter. I'm at Evan Francine, and Ryan is at Cloutier Sec. It's at CLOUTIERSEC. That's where you can find him on Twitter. And that's it. We'll talk to you next week.